They were called the Divine Wind, a last, desperate hope. Most were just kids, some still in their teens. They volunteered, but many felt immense pressure to do so. Before takeoff, they wrote final letters home to their families. Their planes were often old, and many missions failed due to mechanical problems. They were given a manual instructing them to transcend life and death. But what if I told you the first kamikaze wasn't even planned, and that the Japanese had a secret, even more powerful weapon in development? But perhaps the biggest secret is what the surviving pilots felt when the war ended and they never had to fly. The Divine Wind. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific was turning. Japan's mighty navy was in retreat. Its experienced pilots were gone. The empire was desperate. They needed a miracle, a divine wind. They called this new, terrifying strategy the kamikaze. We all know the basic story. Young pilots flying their planes into enemy ships. A suicide mission. But the truth is far more complex. What kind of person would volunteer for this? The official story is they were all eager patriots, willing to die for their emperor. But hidden in old letters and secret testimonies is a different story. A story of pressure, and of a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Because the very first kamikaze attack might have been a complete accident. But the official story of a perfect, planned weapon is a lie. The truth begins with a single, chaotic dogfight. The first kamikaze was an accident. The man credited as the first kamikaze was a pilot named Admiral Takejiro Onishi. In October 1944, he saw the situation was hopeless. He gave the order. But the very first pilot to crash into a ship wasn't part of that order. His name was Lieutenant Yukio Seki. His plane was badly damaged. He was losing fuel. He couldn't make it back. In that final moment, he saw a target of opportunity, a U.S. ship. He made a decision to turn his certain death into a weapon. The High Command saw the devastating results. They saw a new kind of warfare. But they never told the public this. They created a myth of a perfect divine warrior. But this new weapon needed young men to believe the myth. And to make them believe, the military used a powerful psychological trick, one that targeted their deepest fears. The volunteer pressure cooker. They weren't forced. Officially, they were asked to volunteer. But the pressure was immense. A commander would enter a room of young trainee pilots. He would make a grand speech about duty and honor. Then he would ask for volunteers. He would tell them to step forward. But here is the secret. He would then leave the room. The young men were left alone with a clipboard and a pen. Everyone could see who signed and who did not. To not sign was to be branded a coward, a traitor to your friends, your family, your emperor. Many wrote in their diaries of the shame they felt. They didn't want to die, but they felt they had no way out. They were trapped. And once they signed, they were given a manual. This manual didn't teach them how to fly. It taught them how to stop wanting to live. The Manual to Transcend Death. This is the Kamikaze Manual. It was a small book given to every pilot. Its title was Instructions for Transcending Life and Death. It was a guide to brainwashing. It taught them to meditate, to see themselves not as living men, but as souls already dead. They were told their death would be peaceful, beautiful, like a falling cherry blossom. They were told to think of their target not as a ship, but as their bride, a strange, powerful image. But this was all theory. The reality of their final mission was often very different. Because the planes they were given were not what you think. Many were old, broken, and utterly unreliable. In fact, more kamikaze pilots may have been killed by their own faulty equipment than by American guns.
The flying coffins. By 1945, Japan was running out of everything: fuel, metal, good planes. Many kamikaze pilots were given aircraft that were barely airworthy. They were called flying coffins. The engines would fail. The navigation equipment was basic. They were sitting ducks for enemy fighters. Historians now believe that up to half of all kamikaze missions never reached a target. They crashed into the sea, got lost, or were shot down long before they saw a ship. It was a tragic, mechanical failure, but the Japanese High Command had a plan for this too. They weren't just relying on old planes. They were building something new, something far more advanced and far more deadly. Deep in a hidden mountain tunnel, engineers were building a secret rocket plane designed for only one flight. The secret rocket. This is the Japanese answer to the kamikaze problem. Codename Oka, or cherry blossom. It was a rocket-powered bomb. It was carried under a bomber plane, then released miles from its target. It had wings and a pilot. For a few terrifying minutes, it would scream towards an enemy ship at over 600 miles per hour, too fast to shoot down. There was no defense. The pilot was sealed inside. There was no landing gear, no way to come back. It was the ultimate suicide weapon. But it had one critical weakness. The bomber plane that carried it was slow and vulnerable. American fighters quickly learned to target the mothership, to stop the rocket before it was ever launched. But as the war reached its end, a new, even darker question emerged. What happened to the men who survived? The survivors' shame. When Japan surrendered, the war was over. For the kamikaze units, it meant something unbelievable. They would live. But for many, this was not a happy ending. They felt a deep, overwhelming shame. They had prepared to die for their country. Their friends were gone, and they were left behind. They were seen as failures. Some hid their past for the rest of their lives. They never spoke of it, not even to their own families. They carried the weight of a mission they never completed. But they also carried a secret, a truth they only shared decades later, a truth about what they really saw in their final moments. One surviving pilot, in a secret interview, finally revealed what he saw through his windshield, and it changes everything. The final reveal. He said they were not thinking of the Emperor or of cherry blossoms. In those last seconds, they were not divine warriors. They were scared young men. His final thought was not of glory. It was a desperate last-second prayer, a hope that his death would mean something, that his family would be proud. And then he saw it. Not a ship, but the faces of the young American sailors on the deck, men his own age. He saw their fear, and in that instant, he understood. They were all the same. They were all just boys trapped in a war. This is the final, haunting truth of the kamikaze pilots. It wasn't a divine wind. It was a human tragedy, a story not of monsters, but of men. And the real secret they took to their graves was a moment of simple, shared humanity. So the story of the kamikaze pilots is far more than just Japan kamikaze history. It's a deep look into the desperate Japanese kamikaze strategy during the closing stages of the war. We've seen the raw kamikaze attacks footage and heard the powerful kamikaze pilot stories. From the formation of the kamikaze special attack units to the fierce kamikaze battles World War II, these missions were a pivotal and tragic part of the conflict. The myth of the divine wind kamikaze is complex. The history of kamikaze pilots is filled with both duty and immense pressure. We've examined the kamikaze's effectiveness World War II, particularly in battles like the Okinawa kamikaze attacks. But behind every one of those kamikaze suicide missions and all the World War II kamikaze attacks was a human story. The legacy of the kamikaze pilots World War II continues to make us question the very nature of war, sacrifice, and what it means to be faced with an impossible choice.